modern human civilization depends on industrial activity. But the way we've been conducting this activity has been deleterious to our own well-being. To generate electrical power, we burn coal and fossil fuels, both of which are sources of sequestered carbon that's been buried in the earth for millions of years. By burning coal and fossil fuels, we transform that carbon into CO2, which gets released into the atmosphere. As CO2 is a potent greenhouse gas, this accumulation of CO2 is slowly increasing the average global temperature. To prevent this, or at least to try and minimize the damage, two major strategies are being studied and utilized, including the adoption of renewable energy sources, which will decrease the demand for and the pollution of coal and fossil fuels, and carbon sequestration technologies that try to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. Basically, these two strategies are ways to stop putting CO2 in the atmosphere in the first place and removing the CO2 that's there. There's currently a race to develop advanced carbon sequestration technology that isn't prohibitively energy and money intensive, but there does exist a cheap, natural alternative technology for carbon sequestration: the tree. China has historically been one of the world's worst polluters, but now, in the face of serious threats from climate change, China's government is trying to be a historic revolutionary. It's a complicated and nuanced situation, and China's government is far from perfect on this issue, but they're essentially trying to take large-scale material steps to make a difference. And when you put nationality and politics aside, in the face of climate change, that's what really matters, is these large-scale material steps. So what I want to tell you about is a recent announcement from the Chinese government. They are currently completing a 5-year process to increase forest coverage to 23% of the country by the end of the decade. And in this year, 2019, which is almost at the end of the decade, they're going to plant almost 7 million hectares of forest. This is equivalent to a land area the size of Ireland. It will be added to the running total of new forest land planted since the project began in 2016. So the running total is at 33.8 million hectares. These new forests are being added all over, including the suburbs of Beijing to help clean up the air, and in 3 new nature reserves of almost 500,000 hectares each. These large-scale forestry efforts will hopefully yield good results in a few years' time. They plant the trees, and as the trees grow, they build a physical architecture for the ecology that thrives under the canopy. Other plants, like ferns and bushes, grow between the trees, filling in the undergrowth with vegetation, and thickening the soil with their roots and their aging, decaying ancestors. All of this biological activity acts as a tremendous carbon sink, pulling CO2 out of the air and transforming it into sugars and starches, which the plants then integrate into their tissues. These huge tracts of land being turned into forest are a potent resource for carbon sequestration, but there are still some snags. This isn't a perfect solution. You see, all of this carbon that's being absorbed by the plants for their own growth is coming out of the air. It's carbon that's in the carbon cycle. The plants don't remove that carbon from the carbon cycle. Instead, they just hold that carbon in their bodies for a temporary period of time. When they die and their tissues rot, that carbon goes back into the atmosphere. To really address climate change, we need the technology for permanent carbon sequestration. In my opinion, the ideal technology is something that can extract CO2 from the air and/or from seawater and turn it into physical bricks, which we could then bury deep in the earth, so it'll be removed permanently from the carbon cycle. However we do it, we have to permanently remove some of this CO2 from the carbon cycle, just like it was when it was fossil fuels stuck in the ground for millions of years. That carbon was out of the carbon cycle, but we changed that, and it turns out that that's a problem, so we have to fix that. But until that technology is developed, planting millions and millions of trees is our next best bet.